Our next speaker has more than 25 years of experience in economic and social policy across Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, where she has worked with notable organizations. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi is currently the CEO and president of the African Center for Economic Transformation, where she advises governments in Africa on advancing economic transformation. Mavis Owusu-Gyamfi, the stage is yours.
Thank you very much, Norad, for bringing us all together today. And it is excellent to see so many of esteemed colleagues here for today's discussion. This session is about country leadership, but I'd like to focus on Africa, with your permission. In Africa, we are beginning to see shoots of, green shoots of growth again, but that growth remains very fragile. It is always great to see the IMF and the World Bank predicting that the fastest growing economies in Africa in 2025 will be in sub-Saharan Africa. But we must remember, we've been here before. That growth did not protect us from the economic impact of COVID or Russia's war in Ukraine. We've seen crippling inflation, fiscal imbalances, rising and riskier debt, and the growth that we talked about a few years ago did not sustain us from this. We are caught as a continent in a vicious cycle of climate vulnerability, escalating debt, environmental degradation, and most worryingly, jobless growth. African countries currently spend between 2% and 9% of their national budgets to responding to devastating climate-related extreme weather events. The continent is estimated to lose between 5 to 15% of its projected GDP growth by 2050 due to climate change. Alongside this, our countries are spending exorbitant amounts of money on servicing debt. African countries in 2024 spent $102 billion in debt servicing, according to the One Campaign. Now imagine what this money could be used for. This money could be used for health, education, skills development, building green value chains, and generating desperately needed tax revenues. Now, our leaders are grappling with all of this and are increasingly looking at their development through the lens of economic transformation and green growth. And at ACET, all we think about is growth, economic transformation. And we define economic transformation as growth with depth, D-E-P-T-H. This means that our growth must lead to diversification of our economies, enhanced export competitiveness, improved productivity, better use of technology, and most importantly, it must lead to human well-being. And we see this as the best recipe for economic transformation on the continent. We track progress on the continent when it comes to economic transformation using growth with depth. And our index currently covers 30 countries. It's not all 54, it's the 30 where we have data, but that 30 represents 86.7% of the continent's GDP, so they are significant. Now, the worrying thing was that our last edition, which we published in 2023, uncovered some stark realities that we must deal with. So I'm just quickly going to take you through this slide, which is, since 2000, we've seen an erosion in diversification and export competitiveness across the continent, which is extremely worrying. Many countries have seen a concentration on their exports. So their top 5 exports represent 80% of their income base, which is very risky for them whenever there's a global crisis, especially when most of these exports are exporting raw materials. And finally, even though we've seen some increase in productivity, it's nothing to write home about. We started at a very low level, and we saw a minor increase. So at best, it's flatlined across the continent. Second, we see that the gap between as Africa and the early transformers in Asia and Latin America continues to grow. Now, these early transformers, as most of you will know, were at similar levels when most of African countries got their independence. Now, most of these countries are way ahead of us in most of the depth framework. So, this lack of transformation is highly problematic because in the face of pandemics, economic shocks, global conflicts, geopolitical tensions as we see in right now, our countries are struggling to move forward. It's not enough to say a country is growing and its GDP growth is good. If they are not transforming, we have a problem. And as you can see from the graph, every time our transformation is pulled up by growth, it's not an intentional investment in transformation as we saw in the early transformers. So every time our transformation, our growth goes down, so does our transformation. And it normally does so within a crisis. So, the reason we're talking about this right now is that we need to change the way we are investing. Our countries are really thinking about our new comparative advantage in green minerals and asking ourselves, how can we use this comparative advantage to drive the new era of transformation on the continent? We know the pitfalls of trying to develop too much on the export of oil and other minerals in its raw form. So now, our leaders are asking that things are done differently. To do things differently, the first thing we need to do is to articulate what we want. Now, African leaders have traditionally responded to climate crisis by asking for more climate finance. To date, we've only seen 2% of that money come into the continent. So in recent years, their narrative has shifted. They are saying, we will commit to the Paris Agreement, but alongside that, we want to talk about climate change not just as a disaster, but an opportunity for green jobs to boost development, and they are speaking consistently and unapologetically about the importance of investment. They recognize that we don't have the skills that are needed. So currently, Africa has 60% of the world's best solar resources and 30% of the world's critical minerals, yet only 2% of the technology to actually transform these into products. So the narrative is changing. It's about investment and opportunity. Step 2 is the how. Country leaders are saying, we don't need this problem diagnosed and re-diagnosed. It's been diagnosed ad infinitum. It's now time to focus on the how. And they want to agree on proven solutions based on international experience and stick to them. They recognize that they need to work together at a regional level, and they are also focused on adding value to those critical minerals. Now, we've seen countries like Botswana, Uganda, Zambia saying that you cannot export raw critical minerals from their country. You must add value to them, or you cannot have them. Our leaders are also looking at regional integration and asking, where do we mine? Where do we add value? Who is best to produce electric vehicles? Who is best to produce batteries? How do we specialize and share that specialization to enable us to compete effectively across the world? And finally, they are saying that they need to put action into plan. So how do we ensure that we are using our different sources of financing effectively, the right mix of aid, concessional financing, private investment, and debt, and raising it in the right sequencing as well? They are focused on putting an action plan in place, starting with energy. We need energy to industrialize. So how do we ensure that we improve access to energy? So we need a just transition, not a just in transition. Some countries will transition faster than others, and we need to support them on that transition journey. And finally, they need to ensure that we are learning lessons from each other. So some countries that are able to make the leap to green energy, such as Kenya, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Morocco, will lay the foundations for others in West Africa that might take 10 years to get there. It doesn't mean West Africa will not get there. It just means their trajectory will be slightly different. And here we need to talk about odor. We need to look beyond bilateral agreements and start looking at this issue as a national and regional agenda. Support countries to work together to achieve this goal. Africa has 54 countries, but it can't achieve everything as individual countries. It needs to work together. If you engage with our countries on a bilateral basis, but are not willing to look at it on a regional basis, we will continue to struggle to reach there. And this is not about charity. This is about a mutual benefit. Our continent is growing, our youth population is growing, we have the skills, we can produce the goods and services that a rapidly aging world needs it. And that means we need to be interdependent to achieve this. So very finally, I hail from the Ashanti tribe, which is part of the Akan tribe. And we have an old proverb, good beads do not rattle. And that means we need to stop talking. As a development community, we do a lot of rattling. We talk about issues, we make big speeches. I'm standing here making one. We make sweeping commitments without implementation. Let's stop rattling and let's make sure that we are creating great green beats in the world of development. Thank you very much.